Okay.
Maybe people come on in the next few minutes, hopefully. You can they'll catch up or they'll.
And you know me, it takes me a minute to go through my intro slides. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. Really happy to see lots of names that I recognize. We're going to get started. So, thank you for joining us. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Katie Young from KER. And I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Young and she can get started.
Thank you much, Lori. We're going to talk about feeding performance horses this evening. But first, I am going to introduce myself. I am a consulting equine nutritionist with Kentucky Equine Research, and a little bit of my background. I got my undergraduate degree at Missouri State University and then went on to grad school at Texas A&M and got a doctorate in equine nutrition and exercise physiology, and then stayed on at Texas A&M for a few years on the faculty in the equine science department, and then moved on to a company called Farmland Industries that was based in Kansas City, Missouri. So I moved to Kansas City, and there was equine nutritionist and horse feed program manager. And then Farmland ended up going bankrupt. And at that point, I started a relationship with the U.S. Purina Animal Nutrition and worked as a consulting nutritionist for Purina for quite a few years. And they ended up hiring me full time. And then about 6 years ago, went to work as a consulting equine nutritionist for Kentucky Equine Research. I've known the owner, Dr. Joe Pagan, oh gosh, for decades. And so when we talked, it just seemed like a very good fit, and it's a wonderful company to work with. So that's what I am doing at the moment, as well as offering some independent consults for veterinarians and horse owners. And kind of the independent consults, I specialize in myopathies, feeding horses with various muscle myopathies. So that's kind of my background in equine nutrition. But I also have quite a background in horses. I started at the age of about 11 taking lessons and rode Western and barrel raced. And that was a great deal of fun. When I started undergrad, I had an option to take the riding classes offered, and you had a choice of riding English and Western. And I thought, well, I will try something new. And I went to learn to ride English and jump. And that was so much fun that I stuck with it and rode hunters and jumpers and equitation for decades. And then once my eyes are not as good as they were, and my knees are kind of falling apart, and I have some bulging discs, so I'm just kind of broken. So I made the logical transition to eventing. So I have been an eventer now for a while, and it's just the best fun. And these are some of my horses. Actually, this was the Palomino Appaloosa was my main competition horse, and he's now going to be 25 this year, so he's basically retired from competing. And he still has a job as a lesson horse because I have been giving lessons and doing some training, oh gosh, since I was in my late teens, early 20s. So that's Connor, and then this guy in the middle is Boo. And Boo actually passed away last year at the age of 37 and a half. And this was Boo giving a lesson a few months before he passed away. And he actually gave a lesson the day before he passed away. And then he went out into the pasture with his friends and went to sleep and didn't wake up. And quite honestly, if I could go like Boo, that would be my dream. So he had a wonderful life. One of the things I got to do that was great fun while I was with Purina is I was the equine nutritionist for the Budweiser Clydesdales for about 7 years. So that's a picture of me with one. I think those are actually some of the 2 or 3 year olds. So big horses, and that was just so very much fun. And it's one of the horses that I'm riding these days, so that's me with horses. I feed them too, and it's always great fun to figure out how to feed my own horses. But so that is me. But moving back to feeding performance horses, again, our topic for this evening. Some of the things I am going to cover this evening, I'm going to go through the essential nutrients for performance horses, because the nutrients for all horses are the same, but performance horses have a little bit of a different take on some of the nutrients. But we'll talk about a little bit about water and vitamins and minerals and protein and energy. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on energy, because when we talk about energy, that's also energy is fuel for performance. So we are going to talk about the different types of performance, including aerobic work and anaerobic work, and then how to figure out how to fuel the different types of work. Because when you feed the horse, you are feeding various forms of fuel, and you want to fuel the type of work that your horse is going to be doing. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about feeding management and some basics that every horse owner needs to know and be very familiar with in making sure that your horse stays happy and healthy and gets all the nutrient requirements met, and hopefully lives to be 37 and a half and still be sound and healthy. So, to start with, our primary dietary goals. Of course, we want to provide nutrients and calories to meet the horse's requirements. We want to maintain their condition and replenish energy reserves and muscle. And that's a really important thing for performance horses, because when they work, they burn the energy that's stored in their muscles. And so we've got to feed them to make sure that we replenish that fuel. We also want to support tissue growth, adaptation, and repair. Every time a horse works, there is some tissue damage, and we need to always make sure that if you want your horse to stay sound and be able to work again, and in an optimal time, you don't want to have them down for a long recovery time. So we've got to make sure we have the nutrients for that adaptation and repair. And as I mentioned before, we want to optimize the fuel use during exercise. So we give them the fuel sources that they're going to need when they work. We also always have to think about sound feeding management, because no matter what the horse is doing for a living, we must feed them to support the healthy digestive tract, the gastrointestinal tract, and minimize the risk of digestive disturbances. I'm dealing at the moment with a horse that I thought it sure looked on Friday like he was colicking. And so we managed him for colic, and now it appears to be a viral respiratory infection. But this is the time of year we have a lot of digestive issues, lots of colics, some laminitis. So again, we always want to make sure we are feeding to minimize the risk of digestive upset. So the first nutrient that it's pretty easy to talk about is water. A lot of people don't really think about water as a nutrient, but it certainly is. It's a pretty easy nutrient requirement to meet by providing clean, fresh water pretty much as they want, whenever they want. Water intake does vary by the horse's body weight. Bigger horses tend to drink more than small horses. And sweat loss, when they're working hard and sweating a lot, it is what part of my graduate work was on horse sweat loss. And it is amazing how many pounds of sweat they lose, particularly when it's hot and humid. So we want to make sure when they are sweating that they're getting adequate water. And the water loss, the sweat loss is affected by the amount of exercise and the heat and the humidity. And the water intake also varies by diet. In general, some things you feed, for instance, dry forage, they're going to tend to drink more. So we just want to always make sure we're providing adequate water. For example, a maintenance 1,100 pound or 500 kilo horse is going to drink anywhere from 4 to 9 gallons per day. But with exercise, that same 1,100 pound, 500 kilo horse can drink more than 20 gallons per day. So it's a huge amount of water. Some things to be aware of is any changes in water consumption. I very rarely am concerned that a horse might drink too much water unless you're dealing with a horse, an older horse at risk of if you're suspicious of PPID or Cushing's disease, those horses tend to drink a lot and then urinate a lot. So be aware of that. The biggest thing, though, that I get concerned about is when the horse is not drinking as much water, because that does increase the risk of, for instance, an impaction in the gut and then colic. So keep track of how much water your horse is drinking. Another issue is when you're traveling, a lot of horses don't really want to drink. So you always want to encourage water consumption while traveling. Sometimes that means just taking water with you from home. Sometimes you can use electrolytes or flavors to mask unfamiliar taste of the water when traveling. Offer water when hauling, which, as we all know, if we've hauled horses, there's a whole lot of horses. You give them the bucket of water when you're hauling, and they just say, nope, I am never drinking water again. And so I've just got a picture of this product called hydration hay. Something like this, you can use perhaps beet pulp or hay cubes, but if you mix the water with something like this that they find very palatable, then the horse is actually kind of eating its water while it's eating the hay or hay cubes or beet pulp. But you do want to get the horse used to this at home, because there are times I have tried it and the first few times the horse says, nope, I don't. And as a matter of fact, the guy I was dealing with that we thought was colicking, I put all his hay in a muck bucket and filled it with water because the vet said, yep, you know the trick, get him to eat his water. And I did, and I hadn't done that before. And he said, I don't think I want any hay anymore. So sometimes it works well, sometimes not so much. So the next nutrient group that we'll talk about is vitamins. And there are fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, and then water-soluble vitamins, which are the B-complex vitamins and vitamin C. Fresh grass is a great source of vitamins, particularly vitamins A and E. The trick is, though, when the grass is cut and dries up and becomes hay, it loses a great deal of its vitamin activity. Vitamin A and vitamin E in grass hay, well, any kind of hay, I usually figure after about 3 months, I don't really assume that the horse is getting vitamin A or vitamin E from their hay. 6-month-old hay, pretty much no vitamin A or E activity. So we need to be sure on horses that are on hay are getting something to supply adequate vitamins A and E for whatever they're doing for a living. And particularly, we have seen a lot of situations now that are horses on hay only diets, and the blood test for vitamin E is fairly easy to have done, and there are a lot of horses that show low vitamin E status. So it's important in those situations to be aware and make sure that you're supplementing the vitamins that the horses may not be eating. We also, in research, there's been it was shown a decline in B vitamin status in tissues and blood with horses on hay, and particularly working and stressed horses show lower levels of vitamin B. So in these situations too, we want to make sure that the horse is receiving a diet that basically provides things that the typical forages are missing. And then just vitamin E on its own is a very important antioxidant for working horses, that the antioxidant helps protect the muscle fibers from oxidative damage. So for a very hard working horse or a horse that's under stress, or in many of these muscle disorders, when the horse ties up, whether it's RER, PSSM, MFM, those situations, we are recommending a supplement of vitamin E. And when you supplement vitamin E, the most bioavailable form is natural vitamin E in an aqueous form. So the synthetic vitamin E, if the horse is not does not have a condition that requires a higher vitamin E status, synthetic vitamin E in a well-formulated horse feed or ration balancer should be adequate, but hardworking horses, stressed horses, or compromised horses are likely to benefit from a vitamin E supplement. And then minerals. There are a lot of minerals that are essential for bodies to work well or to just maintain well. But those minerals requirements increase when the horse is working, and the harder they work tends to be the higher mineral requirement they have. The other thing, though, that increases the nutrient requirement that increases with work is energy. And so when you increase the feed to meet the increased energy requirements, usually that increase in feed brings along with it an increase in total mineral intake. So it's not usually something that, okay, my horse is working, so I must supplement with this mineral and this mineral and this mineral. It all goes together, but we got to be sure to choose an appropriate feed that is fortified well with the minerals. Another thing that is well known in animals in general is that calcium and phosphorus, not only do we have to be sure that there is adequate calcium and phosphorus in the diet, but that they are in the correct ratio. Both calcium and phosphorus are critical for bone remodeling in performance horses, for metabolic function, for muscle activity, actually for nerve conduction. Calcium and phosphorus are just, ubiquitous in the body. And again, the ratio is really important. Ideally, we want a calcium to phosphorus ratio of about 2 to 1. So in the diet, there's about twice as much calcium as there is phosphorus. That's not a set in stone ratio. 3 to 1 is fine. 4 to 1 should be perfectly fine as long as phosphorus is adequate. For growing horses in research, they've fed up to a 6 to 1 calcium to phosphorus ratio with no problems. But again, you have to make sure that there is enough phosphorus to meet the horse's needs. The reason it is so important is because if there is more phosphorus in the diet than calcium, the phosphorus inhibits the absorption of calcium, and then the horse is calcium deficient just because there was too much phosphorus. So you want at least a 1 to 1 calcium phosphorus ratio, ideally 2 to 1, 3 to 1. I have seen some situations, some alfalfas can have a 10 to 1 calcium phosphorus ratio, and that is rarely an issue, again, as long as there is adequate phosphorus in the diet. So again, that inverted ratio is a serious problem. If a horse is calcium deficient for much of a time period, the body requires calcium, and it is so tightly regulated that if the calcium levels in the blood and tissue are not where they're supposed to be, the body will pull calcium out of its storage to keep the homeostasis, the body levels correct. And the storage place for calcium in the body is in the bone. And unfortunately, when calcium is pulled out of the bone for this reason, that calcium is not replaced. It's an irreversible situation. And basically, the calcium's pulled out of the bone, and that bone can kind of be replaced by cartilage. And again, irreversible. So what you see when this is happening is these weird, subtle, shifting lamenesses, and they don't get better. It's over time, if it's just going to get worse. But the nice thing is it's pretty easy to do a ration evaluation and just, see, okay, where is the calcium and phosphorus in the diet, and make sure that it's at least 1 to 1. The electrolytes are other minerals to be concerned about. In general, and my first research project in grad school was on electrolytes, and I just was using miniature horses. And when at rest, at rest, these minis that were on this was years ago, but their diets were coastal Bermuda grass hay and oats, and they were at mineral balance at rest. I did total digestibility trials, which was really fun. If you get into grad school and somebody says total digestibility trials, you might want to say, oh, because that's when you feed them and you sample all the feeds so that you know exactly what's going in them, and then you sample everything that comes back out of them, and then you analyze everything for whatever nutrients you're looking for, so you can see exactly how much went in, how much came out. So you have so many days of collecting all the poop and all the pee of your horses on trial, and then you get to analyze it, and it's great fun. But anyhow, so at maintenance, my minis were in balance without any extra electrolytes. But in some parts of the world, in South Central Texas, the hay I was using was perfectly adequate in sodium. And in a lot of places, the hays are not, or the grasses are not adequate in sodium. It does not ever hurt to give your horse, I'm going to, with a caveat, usually does not hurt to give your horse white salt, just to make sure that they're getting adequate sodium and chloride in their diet. Potassium is usually well provided by the forage. Forages, for the most part, have plenty of potassium, especially for maintenance. But again, giving them free choice access to salt is not a problem unless your horse basically stands there and eats the salt. That's called psychogenic salt consumption disorder. So if you see your horse standing there eating the salt block, then take the salt block away from them and perhaps add it to the horse's feed so you can make sure they're not going hog wild on salt. Now, moderate to heavy work and/or excessive sweating requires electrolyte supplementation because sweat contains a great deal of sodium, potassium, and chloride. Horse sweat is very different than human sweat. Horse sweat starts out more concentrated in electrolytes than blood. Human sweat is the opposite. It's less concentrated in electrolytes than human blood. And with work, human sweat becomes even more dilute. But horse sweat doesn't so much. It starts out more concentrated and it pretty much stays concentrated. So when they are sweating, they lose a ton of electrolytes. So again, you probably want to look for an electrolyte supplement when your horse is working hard and sweating, or in some, perhaps you're in Florida and it's hot and humid and your horse just stands out and sweats. Some things to realize about well-formulated electrolyte supplements is that they will contain primarily sodium, chloride, and potassium. There are electrolytes available that contain other minerals, but there aren't that many other minerals in, well, there's a little bit of calcium, a little bit of magnesium, but not enough to really worry about. You want sodium, potassium, and chloride. And you also don't need sugar in an electrolyte supplement. There are supplements that have quite a bit of sugar. There are electrolyte supplements that the number one ingredient is a sugar. Some people have thought that having the sugar in there enables the electrolytes to be absorbed from the small intestine, but in reality, the electrolytes are absorbed very well without any sugar. Sometimes people feel that the sugar helps the horses, helps with palatability. But then again, a horse will lick a salt block. So for the most part, it doesn't really need to have sugar to be palatable. And if you offer an electrolyte and the horse won't take it in their feed or from free choice, then you probably want to look at a paste electrolyte so you can give them a specific dose when you need to. So the electrolytes may be supplied daily or only when working or periods of high sweat loss, kind of depending on the horse's needs. Another thing to think about is if a horse is on furosemide, and there are a lot of race horses and actually barrel racing horses that are on furosemide or Lasix, and that changes the mineral loss during exercise. The use of furosemide causes, it's basically a diuretic. It causes electrolyte loss and imbalance through increased urination as well as sweating and weight loss during the activity. And the total electrolyte depletion can be quite significant following intense exercise. And since they are also urinating as well as sweating, the urinary mineral loss includes a substantial amount of calcium and magnesium. And remember, I just mentioned sweat does not include very much, a little bit calcium, magnesium, but not much. But with Lasix or furosemide, they're then losing calcium and magnesium as well. And a typical electrolyte supplementation, even if it contains a little calcium and magnesium, not enough to replace what's lost in the urine for these horses. And then the other thing, after an exercise bout, the horses on furosemide don't have an increased thirst response adequate to replace the water loss from the sweat and the urination. So KER has done research and developed a specific electrolyte, and it's not just one electrolyte, it's a system. And it's called Race Recovery. It comes in a paste and a powder, and you use them both. The protocol after there's a protocol for using the paste, like right around the bout of exercise, and part of that paste increases the thirst response right after exercise, and then the powder is a more of a daily electrolyte, and this protocol together supports greatly reduced recovery time for these horses that are on furosemide. And again, the formulation is different as well to replace that calcium and magnesium. So it increases the thirst response, and it replaces all the minerals, and so the downtime for horses on furosemide is much less when they are on the race recovery system. I want to say one more thing about minerals. It's not particularly about electrolytes, but I talked about the calcium and phosphorus ratio. There's a lot of talk out in social media and other places on mineral ratios beyond calcium and phosphorus. And I will say calcium phosphorus is really the only defined, researched ratio in horses at this time. A lot of suggested ratios. One of them that I hear a lot of times is a copper and zinc ratio, and it's suggested that the zinc to copper should be about 3-to-1, 4-to-1, and that's not a bad idea, but it's not based on research. It's just based horses, according to the National Research Council's nutrient requirements of horses. The requirement for zinc is 40 parts per million in the total diet. The requirement for copper is 10 parts per million in the total diet. And if you look at that, 40 to 10, 4-to-1, okay, there's a ratio. But the horse's body doesn't really care. You want to meet the requirements. There was a suggestion several decades ago that because there can be interactions between a lot of minerals, and we do know there's an antagonistic relationship between zinc and copper. However, at the levels that are fed, you don't see that relationship. My first research project was on copper and zinc because the suggestion was young growing horses in Kentucky were seeing a lot of OCD issues, and someone suggested that it was because of the galvanized drinking buckets, which is zinc. Galvanizing is zinking the buckets, and they thought, okay, they're drinking this water with all this zinc leaching out from the buckets, and it's inhibiting copper absorption, and we do know a lack of copper can increase the risk of OCDs. So they thought, okay, It's the zinc. My first research project was feeding varying levels of zinc and looking at copper absorption. And my horses were on 10 parts per million copper, and we fed up to, I believe, 800 parts per million zinc and did not see any problem with copper absorption. And Dr. Harold Hintz at Cornell was doing a very similar project at the same time, and he looked at up to 1,100 parts per million zinc and still didn't see an issue. And so in the conclusion in my journal article on that, said it's probably not a problem with zinc-induced copper deficiency unless you're grazing your horse close to a zinc smelter. So unless you live close to a zinc smelter, you probably don't have to worry too much about the zinc and copper ratio. And in pretty much every feed and in forages, you're not going to see levels of zinc and copper that are going to be problematic. However, in forages, you're probably going to see deficient zinc and marginal to deficient copper. So again, you got to feed something to balance out the nutrients that tend to be missing in forages. Okay, and then on any other ratio you hear about minerals in horses, there's not research behind them. There's a lot of theories, a lot of guesswork, but there's not research, and so it's not something to spend a lot of time and tears over mineral ratios, other than making sure your calcium phosphorus is correct. Protein in working horses. Horses don't actually have a protein requirement. They have amino acid requirements, and amino acids are the building blocks of all proteins. And different proteins have different amino acids. There's about 21 amino acids. So you can build all sorts of different proteins with different arrays of these amino acids. Amino acids are necessary for muscle maintenance, of course, and repair. And there is some nitrogen lost in sweat of working horses. So amino acids provide nitrogen, and that can replace the nitrogen that's lost in the sweat. It is very important to understand the difference between protein quantity versus protein quality. Because as I said, the proteins are made up of all these different arrays of amino acids, but some of the amino acids are essential and some are not. Essential amino acids are those that the body cannot synthesize themselves. So there are about 10 essential amino acids that must be provided by the diet. And the rest of the amino acids, as long as the body has the building blocks, they can build those amino acids themselves. Quality also has to do with the bioavailability of those amino acids. Because if you have been hanging around with us from the beginning, when I talked about forages, particularly hay, we talked about that the proteins digested in the horse's upper gut are broken down into amino acids and are absorbed, so the horse can meet amino acid requirements, essential amino acids from absorption in the upper gut. But when the protein gets to the hind gut, as we see a lot with hays and some fresh forages, but particularly the dried forages, the protein doesn't all get digested in the upper gut. It gets into the hind gut, and the microbes in the hind gut don't break it down into amino acids. They tear the protein apart into nitrogen and carbon skeletons. Now, the nitrogen then can get washed out through the urinary system, and the carbon skeletons can be absorbed and used as energy, but that protein is not helpful for giving the horse essential amino acids. So the high quality protein sources that have, number one, a really nice level of essential amino acids in the build of the protein, and number two, are pretty well digested and absorbed in the upper gut, so the amino acids are available. The top plant protein for quality amino acids is soybean meal. Canola meal is also pretty good. It's close to protein, but not quite as good. Alfalfa is pretty decent. It's not got a good amino acid profile particularly for growing horses, but it's a pretty decent quality. Milk protein is very high quality. The trick there is milk protein is also very expensive. So when you're looking at feeds and feed manufacturers, we tend to rely on soybean meal as an affordable, very high quality protein source for meeting a horse's essential amino acid requirements. The other thing to consider, a lot of people get hung up on the percent protein in feeds. And quite honestly, the percent protein does not mean that much until you look at the percent of protein in the feed and how much of the feed that you are feeding. For instance, if you're feeding the same amount of a 14% protein and a 10% protein feed, they're going to get more protein from the 14%. But if the 14% protein feed is high calories, so you don't have to feed as much to meet calorie requirements, and the 10% protein feed is lower calories, so you have to feed more, you might actually be providing about the same amount of protein. So you got to think about those things. The horse doesn't have a percent requirement. Their requirement is grams per day. Or when I talked about copper and zinc and I was talking about parts per million, that's of the total ration. So you still, to figure out how, if you're meeting the requirement, you got to say, okay, if it's 10 parts per million, but you're feeding 20 pounds, how many grams per day is that to meet the requirement? And
Dr.
then
Katie,
energy. Oh, yes,
Dr. Katie, can I
sure.
just ask a question? You might go into it later on, but one of the things I think I had mentioned this to you that I'm seeing quite often, people that are feeding sometimes one, two ration balancers, and then
I
on
have
top of,
slides.
oh, good. And then more amino acids in a supplement form. You have,
I
you're going to
yeah,
cover
when
it?
we can cover that when if I don't cover it in the slides, ask me then when we get to those ration balancer slides.
Okay, and then just quickly to let everyone know, because I did forget to mention it at the beginning, if you want to ask a question, up the top where it says Q&A, please put your question in there and we'll ask the questions at the end. Okay,
Absolutely.
thank you.
And two, if there's a question that comes in while I'm talking about that subject, then Lori will ask me the question. We're kind of, she's being the moderator and saying, oh, yep, that's one I really need to ask right now. But if not, I'll get to the questions at the end. So, energy requirements. Calories. Calories equal energy or fuel because calorie is the unit of measure for energy. And while it's kind of interesting, energy is a nutrient requirement, but energy itself is not really a nutrient. The nutrients that fulfill the energy requirement include carbohydrates, which are both the structural carbs or fibers, and non-structural carbs or starch and sugars. And then fats are a source of energy, and protein is a source of energy. Protein, however, we want to use protein to meet amino acid requirements. Protein used as a fuel is a very inefficient fuel source, and it ends up being a really expensive fuel source. So if a horse isn't getting enough calories or energy from carbs or fats, then they will use the protein in their feed and in their bodies for energy, but would rather not see that happen. And you will see that's one of the things when horses aren't getting enough calories and they lose weight, they lose a lot of muscle because they're breaking down their own muscle for calories to maintain body processes. So again, protein's not what we want to use as a fuel source. And then body condition scoring is the best tool to evaluate if the energy or calorie requirements are being met. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But before we get there, I want to talk about, I mentioned in the back in the introduction about types of exercise and making sure that you provide the fuels that are appropriate for the different types of exercise. There are two classifications of exercise and they utilize different fuel sources. So that is aerobic exercise and anaerobic exercise. Aerobic exercise is basically long, slow distance work. So the horse is not exercising at maximal capacity, and they usually, the aerobic exercise can last a long time. It's low to moderate intensity, and the fuel source for aerobic exercise is primarily fat. So when the horse has fat available to use as a fuel, then with aerobic exercise, they're going to burn that fat. If they don't have enough fat, then they can burn other fuel sources, but we really want fat available for burning for aerobic exercise. Anaerobic exercise, and these are two very different metabolic pathways in the body. The other thing to say about aerobic exercise is the metabolic pathway is very efficient. The unit of fuel that metabolically is ATP, or adenotriphosphate. And for every fat molecule that is burned aerobically, they get quite a lot of ATPs. Anaerobic exercise, on the other hand, is maximal intensity and short duration. I tend to describe it as short blasts of maximum power and speed. And the fuel source for anaerobic activity is primarily glycogen. Glycogen is a polysaccharide. It's an animal storage form of sugars. So it is stored in the muscles and also in the liver, and it's used as fuel for anaerobic activity. Again, if there's not enough fat available, aerobic activity could use glycogen, but the glycogen stores are usually much smaller than fat stores. So you're going to run out of glycogen before you're going to run out of fat. One of the reasons why anaerobic exercise is shorter duration. Aerobic exercise can go a very long time. Anaerobic exercise can only go usually a few minutes. Dietary NSC, which is starches and sugars, provide the sugar molecules to build glycogen. So when you feed the horse the starch and sugars that you feed, one of the big jobs of the NSC is to refuel the glycogen that, again, is stored in the muscle tissue and in the liver. So the fuel use during exercise, the work duration and intensity dictate the type of fuel primarily used. So again, aerobic metabolism, slower process, very efficient. The fuel is primarily fat, if it's available, and then glycogen or glucose. And the gaits that are typically aerobic are going to be the walk, of course, the jog or trot, and the lope or canter. And one of the things that's very interesting is as a horse gets more and more fit, it can even the hand gallop can be aerobic. When you go and watch an upper level 3-day event, cross country, which those horses are going pretty darn fast, but it's a test of endurance, and they need to be fit enough that they're mostly using aerobic metabolism. Otherwise, they're going to run out of fuel before they get to the end of this very long cross-country course. Anaerobic metabolism, remember, short blasts of power and speed. It is a fast process, but it's inefficient. They can run out of fuel. And another thing with aerobic metabolism, when the fuel is being burned aerobically, the waste products, the end products, are basically water and carbon dioxide. But with anaerobic metabolism, when that glycogen is burned anaerobically, one of the big waste products is lactic acid. So if you get a bunch of lactic acid accumulating in the muscle from anaerobic metabolism, that can lead to an end of exercise because that lactic acid is kind of a nasty waste product. So again, it's fast process, it's inefficient, they can run out of fuel. The fuel for anaerobic is glycogen or glucose. And the types of exercise would be sprints, Western performance events such as barrel racing, roping, and then show jumping, thoroughbred racing. These are all primarily anaerobic metabolism fuel sources. However, the fuel used during exercise is never completely one or the other. Even a horse that's out walking on a trail ride, it's not 100% aerobic. So for an endurance horse, this bar just shows for an endurance horse how much of the fuel used is glycogen, anaerobic, versus fat, aerobic. And you can see for the endurance horse, primarily fat, but there's still glycogen used. Again, never only one or the other. A racehorse, on the other hand, you can see that red is glycogen. It's primarily glycogen with just a little bit of fat. And then the Western performance horse, lots of glycogen, just a tiny bit of fat. And from this, even from these bars, I do hear from Western performance horse people, so why would it ever be advantageous to feed one of these, like a barrel racer? Why would you want to feed a horse fat? Or roping horses or cutting horses? Why would you want to feed them fat? Well, because what are the horses doing, especially when you go to a roping or a cutting or something like that? What are the horses doing before they go into the pen for their performance event? They're probably out in the warm-up pen loping. That would be an aerobic activity. And if you don't have the fuel sources for the aerobic activity, remember, for aerobic, they can burn glycogen. So what happens if they're loping and loping and loping and they burn up all their glycogen and they go in the pen to run and there's no glycogen? Have you ever heard anybody say, oh man, I left my best run in the warm-up pen? They might have if they'd used up their glycogen. So it's important, again, to think about the fuel sources and then how you want to fuel your horse to make sure you are maximizing the fuel available for their specific type of performance. So feeding carbohydrates as fuel. Non-structural carbohydrates, remember starch and sugars, tend to call them NSC. A lot of horse owners are just scared these days of NSC. Don't want any starch or sugar in your horse's diet, right? Well, wrong. If you've got a performance horse, you got to have some NSC because that's what refuels the glycogen storage tanks. The other thing I tell horse people is the only fuel used by the brain is glucose, simple sugar, part of NSC. It's also the main fuel that is used by the horse's feet. When I'm on a cross-country course, I would like to make sure that my horse has adequate fuel for his brain and his feet. I think that's kind of important. But yes, some horses are very sensitive to NSC in their diets, and so we have to be aware of that. But for a typical working performance horse, NSC it may be a concern, but it's not a huge concern. And we cannot feed horses no NSC. It's not possible and it's not healthy. So starch and sugars, primary dietary source of NSC is grains. The grains tend to be pretty high in starch and sugars. Corn is about 70% NSC, oats are about 50% NSC. If you have a horse that is sensitive to carbs, we probably don't want to feed a lot of straight oats and definitely not straight corn, but they're good ingredients and there's no reason to be terrified of some corn, some oats in a horse's feed when it's formulated properly for the horse it's intended for. Grains, the NSC does provide glucose for immediate fuel and substrate for glycogen synthesis. Again, it's the main fuel for anaerobic work, highly digestible, can cause digestive disturbances as if overfed. When we talked about metabolic horses, one of the things we did talk about was an overload of soluble carbs from the upper gut to the hind gut. We don't want to see that, so we want to make sure that we don't feed too much NSC in one meal. Split the meals up, smaller meals more often. We do see elevated plasma glucose insulin response post-meal. That's normal. For a healthy horse, that's not a problem. For an insulin dysregulated horse, that's something to be aware of and try and manage. There's a thought that NSC can make a horse high or hot. There's research that maybe on some horses there may be some effect. I personally, in my many decades with horses, have not had or seen a horse that really made a big difference, the amount of NSC in the diet. Personally, I think turnout, work are really good things to help keep a horse from getting hot. If you have a horse that has to go on stall rest, you might want to reduce the calories, because too many calories and not enough activity can certainly make a horse higher, hotter, more hyperactive. And then the structural carbs or fibers that are provided by the forages in the diet, and the feeds will always have some fibers, but forages and ingredients such as hulls or beet pulp are primary sources of fermentable fibers. And again, in nature, the major dietary source of calories is actually forage. The digestibility of fibers, however, is variable. Some fibers are very digestible or fermentable, and some are not so much and end up going all the way through the horse, and you pick it up off the ground from the other end. The microbes actually ferment fibers into volatile fatty acids. Fibers are not digested or absorbed in any way in the upper gut. They make it all to the hind gut with all the microbes, and they break them down into volatile fatty acids. The VFAs are absorbed from the hind gut and are, for maintenance horses, they may well be the primary source of calories. For working horses, you really can't even feed a hard-working horse. You can't feed enough fiber to meet their calorie requirements. Fibers are also very necessary for normal hind gut function. So to keep the horse's gut healthy, we want to make sure there's adequate fiber. And again, primary fuel for maintenance activity, but can't support maximal workloads. A few of the volatile fatty acids from the fermentation of fiber can be synthesized into the glucose in the liver for glycogen refilling, but that is a very slow, inefficient process. So a hard-working horse will not be able to refuel the glycogen storage tanks. Fats as fuel. Fat, again, is the major source of fuel for aerobic activity as long as it's available. Fats in the diet are highly digestible. Many fats are very palatable. Some are not so much, but most of the plant sources, the seed oils, such as soy oil, corn oil, are very palatable. They do have a little bit of difference now, we know, in fatty acid composition, such as omega-3, omega-6. That's something we've actually is pretty recent learning. But fat as a fuel, we're really not even as concerned about the fatty acid profile. Essential fatty acids do support hair, coat, and skin conditions. So a lot of times you start adding a little bit of fat to the diet and you see the horses, their coat blooms and they just look really nice. Again, primary energy source for aerobic metabolism. It does, when you start adding fat to the diet, it does take 21 to 28 days for the body to actually get more efficient at utilizing the dietary fat as fuel. And we've seen in research on feeding fat that it can lead to increased stamina, because when the fat is available, the horse's body will use that fat to fuel the aerobic activity and spare the glycogen, so there's still glycogen there when the horse needs it for that blast of power or speed. However, fat cannot be utilized as a substrate for glycogen synthesis. There is no metabolic pathway. You've got to have some type of carb to actually fuel the glycogen storage. So how do you know if you're meeting calorie requirements? Well, you can look at your horse's body weight. We all know that if you get calories, you can gain weight. So how do you know what your horse weighs? You can use a livestock scale, body weight tape. There are several body weight equations available. There's actually an app that is available that you can use. And feeding recommendations are actually based on horse's body weight. So it's really important to know how much your horse weighs to kind of make sure you're giving them the right amount of feed, and also things like dewormer and drugs. If your horse, everybody kind of thinks, oh, typical horse is 1,000 pounds. Well, if you deworm for a 1,000-pound horse and your horse is 1,400 pounds, you are just spitting in the wind and wasting your money on dewormer. So it's good to know how much your horse weighs. The scale, of course, is the most accurate. A lot of people don't have access to a livestock scale. Body weight tapes can be okay. They're better than nothing. I was at a meeting a couple months ago, and all these people brought their different body weight tapes, and then we'd put the horse over the scale, and they were all over the board. There are also equations available, and next slide has the basic body weight equation. There's also the Healthy Horse app, and I assume it's available in Canada. I actually have not looked, but are you saying no?
I couldn't get it.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
You need to go work on the University of Minnesota because they put this out. it's a really handy little app. Okay, so if you can't use the Healthy Horse app, again, body weight tapes or the body weight equation, which is body weight in pounds, heart girth in inches times heart girth in inches times body length in inches divided by the magic number 330. Gives you body weight in pounds. And I should have looked this up, and I haven't. I am sure there's a metric conversion. But that is the body weight equation that's been around, I think, as long as I've been in equine nutrition. But that certainly gets you in the ballpark. So it's a nice, you just have to have something to be able to measure. And then the question is that what your horse should weigh? So you use your body weight equation, you put them on a scale, you go, okay, my horse is 1,240 pounds. Okay, does that mean your horse should be 1,240? Or should it be 1,350? Or should it be 1,025? It is very important to know how to judge that, because that helps you determine, is your calorie intake too much, too little, or just right? And the way we do that is body condition scoring. This is a scoring program that was developed back in the 80s at Texas A&M by Don Henneke, who put together this system actually to do his research on broodmares. And it has been used all over the world since then. And it's just an objective way to say, is your horse fat, is your horse thin, or is your horse just right? And there are 6 areas where horses tend to store fat. And those areas are over the crest of the neck, over the withers, over over their back, at the tail head, behind the shoulder, and over the ribs. And the body condition score ranges from 1, which is poor or extremely emaciated, up to 9, which is extremely obese. In general, we want to see horses that are a body condition score of 5 or moderate. And for performance horses especially, we want to see them at a 5. The best way to evaluate body condition score is to put your hands on each of these areas, like feel over the crest of the neck, and you can read on body condition scoring chart, it tells you what things, how they should feel. So I go back, feel over the crest of the neck. Are they kind of cresty? Is that feel at about a 5? Is it a 6? Is it a 7? Is it a 3? And then each of the areas I feel, and you palpate the amount of fat. And you've got to do it to a lot of horses. And you really get a good feel of what each area should feel like. Horses are just like people. Some of them store a lot of fat on the crest of the neck and not much over the ribs. Some of them, draft horses, tend to get a whole big pad of fat behind the shoulders. So you look at all the 6 places and kind of average them together. and say, okay, I got a 6, I got a 5, I got a 5, I got a 4.5, I got another 6, and kind of average and say, okay, altogether, this is about a 5.5. And we can go to half body condition scores. I worked with a veterinarian once who scored each area and then calculated the average, and he'd come up with a 7.3. That, no, in that case, that's probably a 7.5. We don't want to get into the tenths. Halves are perfectly fine. About 40 to 50 pounds body weight for a typical 1,100 or so pound horse is the amount to change one body condition score. I've had people say, oh gosh, my horse needs to lose 300 pounds. I'm going, no, that's 6 body condition scores. I don't think so. I think your horse needs to lose 25 to 50 pounds. But knowing how to body condition score really helps you make those kind of, educated decisions. So again, this is a body condition scoring chart that I recommend. There's all sorts of, the charts are pretty much, they say the same things. They're all based on Don Henneke's, his research. But you can find them. This is from the KER website. They're all over the internet. But quick and dirty, if you look at a horse and you can see ribs, in general, that means the horse is less than a body condition score 5. If you can't see ribs, then you walk up and you feel over the ribs. For a 5, you don't want to see the ribs, but you want to feel them right under the surface. It's kind of like, well, my hands are kind of bony, but typically on the hands, when you run over your hand, you can't really see the bones, but you feel them right under the skin. That's, in general, that's what a 5 is going to look and feel like. If you can't find ribs, the horse is fat. The horse will lie and say, oh no, that's muscle. No, that's fat. So it's a horse that probably needs to lose weight. So here's your little practice. If we say, let's see, this horse, top left is number 1. Horse top right, number 2. Horse on the bottom, number 3. Which one do you think, let's just start. Which one do you think is the fattest? I can't see or hear anybody. So I'm thinking some of you may have looked at this mare and said maybe she's the fattest. No, she is not. You can actually see ribs. She's got a belly. That's because she's a brood mare. This mare actually is a body condition score 5. This mare is a 4.5. This horse, don't know, kind of looks like a gelding, but I'm not sure, is a 7. Belly has nothing to do with fatness. Few reasons a horse might have a belly. Brood mare who's pregnant. Brood mare who's not pregnant, but has been pregnant 7 times in 7 years. If I was that brood mare and gravity caused my belly to hang down and somebody said I was fat, I would smack them and say, you stand on all fours and have 7 babies in 7 years. The other thing, a parasite infestation can cause a big belly. But belly, remember the 6 areas where they store fat? The belly wasn't part of them. So don't get confused by a belly. Final thing that can cause a big belly is if they're on a high fiber diet, like we've heard of grass bellies and hay bellies. That may just be a lot of fiber fill in the gut. It makes a big belly. And actually, this mare has a little bit of a belly too, but she is actually a body condition score 5. And kind of fun fact, this picture is actually one of the brood mares that this is a picture from Don Henneke's original research. So that's one of the mares that this system was actually, designed around. I just find that kind of fun. It's one of the Texas A&M connections. Don Henneke was in the grad student group right before me when I got to A&M. So my major professor was actually on his graduate committee. So I was taught how to do body condition scoring by the folks who developed body condition scoring, which is kind of fun. So again, belly has nothing to do with fatness. High fiber diet, parasite infestation, or broodmares. So what is the ideal body condition? I said in general, it's a 5. For working horses, less than a 4, we have reduced energy stores, decreased muscle mass, reduced stamina and recovery, and reduced cold tolerance. But a body condition score greater than 6, increased dead weight, which is not great for performance, impaired thermoregulation, excess weight on joints and hooves, and when you get to a 7 or above body condition score, we have increased risk for insulin resistance and laminitis. So performance horse, 4.5, you may see some 4.5s, like race horses sometimes. You can see 4.5s on the 3-day event horses at the end of a big event, but you don't want them a 4.5 going into it because they probably won't make it all the way through. And again, you don't really want to see over a 6 because then you've got impaired performance from carrying all that excess weight. Calorie intake's easy. What about the other nutrients? What about protein, vitamins, and minerals? How do you tell if they're sufficient? For protein, specifically the amino acid balance, you can look at the hair coat, muscle tone, hoof growth, and quality. Their top line especially, are they able to develop a top line? You can look at antibodies because the protein is very important for the structure of antibodies. So if a horse is not getting adequate protein, they may not have appropriate immune function. Vitamins and minerals, there we definitely can see for some of the vitamins and minerals an effect on immune function, bone density, hoof growth, and quality. But a lot of times you don't have any visible signs until there's a significant deficiency over time. For instance, if the horse has a zinc deficiency, it can take so long. Zinc is really important in hooves. You may just have kind of poor feet and think, well, my horse genetically has poor feet and maybe it needs more zinc. So you want to choose a feed that will meet the horse's needs when fed to maintain the body condition. Pay attention to minimum feeding rates because there are a lot of feeds out there that are designed to meet requirements when fed at least 0.4 pounds per 100 pounds of body weight. And if you get less than that, they're not getting all the nutrients they need. And sometimes you just need to talk to somebody and get a ration evaluation done to make sure that you are meeting the requirements. Supplements. People love supplements. They're wonderful, and you feel like you're doing such good things for your horses. Nutritional supplements. You got to recognize requirements and that adding nutrients to a balanced diet may result in imbalances and or excesses. So just because you think, oh, she said zinc was important for feet, so maybe I ought to be feeding zinc. You only want to feed zinc if the diet is deficient in zinc. There's a caveat here. I already talked about electrolytes and salt. That's a supplement that I do recommend. Diets are almost always deficient in sodium, potentially chloride, especially for working horses. Sometimes amino acids can be a nutritional supplement. For the most part, if the total diet is adequate in protein and it's a high quality protein with essential amino acids, then I only recommend amino acids when the horse, for some reason, has a higher requirement, such as one of the myopathies. Now, there are times that you might have a feed that you really like that's just kind of a lower protein, and you might need a protein or an amino acid supplement. But again, that's something, maybe do a ration evaluation and look at. Antioxidants. It's hard to go wrong with some antioxidants, especially with a hardworking performance horse. And the maximum tolerable amount of something like vitamin E is really, it's a high maximum tolerable amount. So a little bit of antioxidant to supplement a hard-working horse, such as vitamin E, or actually coenzyme Q10 in some situations, can be very helpful for a horse. Hoof supplements, usually a good quality, balanced diet is going to have all the nutrients to support good quality hooves. Some horses genetically have poor quality hooves, not a lot you can do. I was never a proponent of hoof supplements until I had one that tried to rip his hoof off, and I was going, it's going to take me a year to grow that hoof back. Ah. And I said, well, okay, I'm going to try a hoof supplement. And since I work with KER, I said, I am going to try BioBloom. And my gosh, that sucker grew his foot back in about 8 months. My farrier was amazed. So if you've got a reason that you really do need to support your horse's hooves, I would say this is one that's worth a try, because I personally saw great things, and there are a whole lot of people. I had one of the other KER employees was using BioBloom, and she said, I can't afford to have my farrier come every 2 to 3 weeks. His feet are growing so fast. So she cut down, and she's feeding about a quarter of the amount, although she may have taken him off it entirely now. So anyhow, nutritional supplements, make sure they're on a balanced diet to start with, and then do a ration evaluation. There may be situations that a nutritional supplement could be helpful. Non-nutritional supplements, the good ones are designed to address specific conditions. But if you're looking at one of these supplements, look for research and published research showing evidence of efficacy. I was looking up a supplement on one of the private consults, and on the website, it said there was research behind it. And so I started clicking through trying to find the research, and I finally dug up the research paper, and all the research paper said was the active ingredient appears to be safe. Cool. And it was expensive. Didn't appear to be doing anything, but at least you're not going to make your horse sick. So I guess that's good. So again, look for research evidence of efficacy. And I just threw out some of the groups of non-nutritional supplements. Digestive aids, I kind of categorize those that help with digestive health as, there are buffers now for stomach acid that can be helpful with reducing risk of ulcers. They're actually in the stomach, and there's Equine as a buffer that actually gets into the hindgut. There are a lot of digestive health supplements out there that don't have any research behind them. Some of them I can look at the ingredients and say, well, that looks like it's not going to do any harm, and don't know if it's going to help, but at least no harm is a good thing. There are also a lot of supplements for digestion and absorption enhancement. There are supplements that have digestive enzymes. If you got a healthy gut, just throwing in more enzymes isn't going to necessarily mean any more nutrients are absorbed, because there are only so many pathways for absorption. So again, look for research that indicates it's doing any good, and not just, and there's lots of people who'll be happy to take your money for supplements, and you can spend so much money on supplements. In general, unfortunately, the ones with research, and as a horse owner, I'm saying this, unfortunately, the ones with research that work and help your horse are very rarely cheap. But that's because they are products that have a lot of research. Research is expensive, and they're effective. So, and usually they may be expensive, but they're usually not as expensive as the prescription medications that you might have to use if you're not getting help from those specific supplements. But oral joint supplements, there are a lot of them that are not even absorbed. So again, look for research and efficacy. Calming supplements, the ones that are legal in competition for performance horses are likely not effective at all. Tends to be the ones that actually make your horse calm are going to test positive on a drug test. So, but again, that's something to just kind of be aware of when you're looking for calming supplements. And then prebiotics, postbiotics, and probiotics. Prebiotics are food for the microbes in the gut. Probiotics are the actual live bacteria that you can feed the horse, and hopefully they'll get to the hindgut. And postbiotics are like the fermentation products of probiotics or microbes. So prebiotics, even the fiber in the forage actually is a prebiotic. There may be some prebiotics that get to the hindgut and do some good. Not a lot of research is very exciting about specific prebiotics that are making the hindgut better than it was with just a well-balanced feed, but at least prebiotics usually don't cause any harm. Probiotics, not a lot of good research on efficacy of probiotics. First, do they make it to the hindgut where they can live? There are a few that do apparently make it to the hindgut, but when they do get there, do they do anything good? And the final thought on probiotics is when you get that container, does it actually have in it what it's supposed to? Is it alive? Because most of those products, when they're tested, they don't actually meet their label guarantees. So postbiotics are a very interesting field of research at the moment, and there are some postbiotics that are looking really kind of promising on what types of things they may be able to do in helping the horse. So again, look for research evidence of efficacy. I keep mentioning maybe just doing a ration evaluation or a ration analysis, and that just is looking at the total diet, calculating the nutrients provided in grams or milligrams per day, comparing it to the requirements, evaluating current status and saying, my diet looks good, my diet doesn't look good. And of course, let the horse help. You know, the horse's body condition score will kind of help you figure out calories and so on and so forth. But I got to tell you, it's not the simplest thing to do yourself. There are some tools. You can calculate your rations by hand. As a grad student, nutrition, especially equine nutrition, has done this. It's really not fun. You can use the NRC basic calculator, which is online, but it's tough because you can figure out from the NRC, you can see what the horse's requirements should be. There's a lot of individual variation, and NRC is basically considered to be the minimum amount to meet nutrient requirements, not necessarily optimal. There are various computer programs available. You can lease some, you can buy some. Some you have access through feed companies, such as KER's MicroSteed. That is available for the KER partner companies. So that's one you do have some access to. There are also independent equine nutritionists throughout the world now. When you do go for an independent equine nutritionist, be sure to check for credentials. One of the first things you can ask is, so where did you get your PhD? Because that's kind of there. I have seen people that say they are certified equine nutritionists. There is no certification program for equine nutrition. So if they say they're certified, that's my first question. Who certified you? Because universities don't do that. And the Equine Nutrition or Equine Science Society doesn't do that. There's just really nobody who certifies equine nutritionists. So when you go out there, be careful on, you know, who you start asking and paying to help you. But again, evaluation tools are available, and KER can help you there. And of course, Brooks can help you as well. So if you're looking for help with a ration evaluation, you've got some good resources. Choosing your feed then. Look for a feed designed with fuel sources to meet your horse's needs, including energy partitioning that shows you how much of the energy is coming from NSC for anaerobic work, how much of the energy is coming from fat for aerobic work. And then, of course, a calorie level to fit your individual horse. As your horse works harder, they're probably going to be needing more calories. If they're not working that hard, they may not need many calories. We'll talk about that in a moment. As workload and fitness level increase, you're going to probably end up increasing the amount of the daily ration, or sometimes just choosing a higher calorie feed. You can feed the same amount, but it's like higher fat level, so it's got more calories per pound. And then, of course, make sure forage is good to excellent quality, because poorer quality forage does not provide as many nutrients or as many calories as high quality forage. And this is just kind of illustrate energy partitioning. These two pies show the total number of calories or digestible energy provided by protein or fat or NSC or fiber. So you can see, let's see, I've got to get up here close and squint. Okay, this little orange, no, the yellow is the calories coming from protein. Green is calories from fat. Orange is calories from NSC. And the kind of aqua is the calories from the fiber. And you can see the pieces of the pie from each of the sources of fuel are different for those two feeds. So, for instance, this one has more calories coming from NSC, so that's probably a feed that is more appropriate for a horse that's working anaerobically versus more calories coming from fat, which would be this one, the green. That's going to be more appropriate for a horse that's doing more aerobic work. So that's how you kind of choose what feed is going to fit your horse's type of work. And then remember, horses are individuals. They have, just like people, we have different metabolic rates, different types of metabolism. So these are two little mares that were my lesson horses years ago. The little sorrel is Tegan, and the little paint is Keelan. They're both basically stock horse breeding. They're both 14-3 hands. They did about the same number of lessons, toted around little kids, hopping over little jumps, about the same amount every week. And Tegan, I kept her pretty much at a 5 to 5.5 body condition score. Keelan was usually a 6 to a 6.5. And Tegan was on free choice Bermuda grass hay and 6 pounds of performance feed. Keelan was on free choice Bermuda grass hay, and she'd have stayed at a 6 to a 6.5 with nothing else. But I knew she needed more nutrition than just hay, so she got a pound of ration balancer. Two horses, similar breeding, same job, about the same size, completely different feeding program because different metabolisms. So if you got an easy keeper, what do you do? Because as I keep saying, forage doesn't always provide, especially a working horse, it's not going to have the amino acids that they need. It's not going to have all the vitamins. It's not going to have all the minerals. So ration balancers are designed for that. They're fed in small amounts, usually for a 1,100-pound horse or so. It's going to be 1 to 2 pounds per day. And that's going to meet their nutrient requirements along with enough forage. The forage is meeting the calorie requirements. You need the ration balancer to meet the other nutrient requirements. Some people want to have, if you're feeding really good quality hay, for instance, alfalfa, a high protein legume hay, then you might want to just go with a vitamin mineral supplement. I so rarely recommend that because I want to make sure that they have adequate protein. You hear so many people talking about, I can't get a good top line on my horse. Well, you're probably not getting enough protein. Now, do you need a protein supplement on top of ration balancing feed? Probably not. It may not hurt, but again, I tend to just say, okay, make sure you're feeding an adequate amount of ration balancer. If you're feeding 1 pound, maybe you go to 2 pounds a day. So, and 2 pounds a day of ration balancer for an 1,100-pound horse and good quality hay, you're probably meeting the requirements. There again, you could have a ration evaluation done and make sure. And finally, for these easy keepers, sometimes a grazing muzzle is your best friend, because this little halflinger was a lesson horse I used to have, and he lived with a brome round bale, and he never even saw grass. But he would, I swear, eat himself into the round bale and not come out until it was gone. So he got a grazing muzzle even when he was on a round bale. And that picture there, you can see his enormous crest, and that is Klinger the halflinger. And he was living with a grazing muzzle with a round bale, and that's as skinny as I could get him. He was also worked regularly. He did not become laminitic while I had him. So I call that a success. And finally, just the feeding management tips to help keep a healthy horse. Feed horses by class. Feed the horse according to what the horse is doing for a living. If it's a performance or working horse, feed it that way. If it's a pasture potato who is just looking pretty for a living, feed him that way. If it's a breeding horse, a growing horse, feed them appropriately to meet their nutrient requirements. And then feed according to body weight to maintain the appropriate body condition. Feed adequate forage or roughage. It's a minimum of 1% of their body weight per day on a dry matter basis. So that's going to be for a 1,000-pound horse, a minimum of 10 pounds a day of hay, or grass is very high water content. So that's way more pounds of as fed grass per day. Feeding 1.2, 1.5%, 2% body weight per day of forage is not a problem. Just, don't get below the minimum. Measure feed and hay by weight, not volume. There are no feeding directions that say feed a scoop of feed. It says feed pounds or kilograms of feed, or, per 100 pounds of body weight. Maximum of about 0.5% of grain in one meal. And that's to minimize the risk of an overload of NSC into the hindgut, which can lead to colic or laminitis. And that's based on half a pound per 100 pounds of body weight. If you have like a pelleted feed or even a grain-based feed that has a lot of fiber ingredients, then you can feed more of it because it's got lower starch and sugars in it. So that 0.5 pounds or 0.5%, that's really grain. That's based on corn and oats. So in reality, most commercial feeds, you can feed more than 5 pounds of feed in a meal to a 1,000-pound horse. But to make sure that you don't risk the chance of overload to the hindgut, and so the digestion and absorption will be most efficient, the recommendation of feed small amounts often. And when you feed smaller amounts, it's best if you can space them evenly through the day. If you feed 2 meals a day, 12 hours apart, as best you can. If you feed 3 meals a day, maybe 8 hours apart if you can, although I realize nobody's going to be getting up at 3 a.m. and going, well, somebody. I say that and somebody's going to say, I get up at 3 a.m. and go feed my horses. And I say, good for you. You are a better person than me. And then avoid abrupt ration changes. Make any changes gradually, whether that's a change in feed or even a change of hay. There was a study done at Texas A&M quite a few years ago, and they identified the number one risk factor for colic actually was a cold turkey change in hay. So, and that's not even going from one type of hay to another. That can be from going from a good quality brome to a poorer quality brome, or the other way. So anytime you're making changes, try to make them gradually. A small change in a few days, a big change, you may take a few weeks to make that change gradually. So take home, choose a feeding program that provides all the essential nutrients to support your performance horse. Provide adequate water, provide electrolytes, free choice salt, or electrolyte supplement as needed. Feed to provide appropriate fuel or energy sources, and practice good feeding management. All those little rules that we've all heard, but that I went through at the end. And then, of course, get a good idea of your horse's body weight and the appropriate body weight by knowing body condition scoring. Thank you all very much. I am happy to take any questions, and keep in mind, we're happy to help if you want to contact Lori or someone else at Brooks, or contact us at KER. We're happy to answer questions. So, Lori, do we have any that have come in?
Got a few questions. I will make a correction because Candace said that she was able to get the healthy horse.
Hey.
So I wasn't looking in the right place. I was looking for the description, like the outline, and I couldn't find an app that had that same look. So maybe Candace could send that to me because she has my email.
Excellent.
And you do have to pay for it, so it was $2.99.
I was going to say big bucks.
Yeah,
It's yeah.
yeah,
So-
big bucks. So I'd be happy to have that. Then there's just a couple of questions. So the first lady asked, I think she was referring to the anaerobic or aerobic. Second level and above dressage are considered to be what type of metabolism?
Second level, actually, dressage in general is still considered to be aerobic.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Even Grand Prix.
Yeah.
Now, if you spend a lot of time like working on lead changes, tempi changes, and your horse gets really frazzled and stressed, you might be getting a little bit into anaerobic there. But mostly that's going to be aerobic.
Yeah. Okay. And the next one, same person asked, can you comment on what to feed a horse that is out 24/7 in the winter, especially very cold weather?
That's a great question, and it depends on your goal. If the goal is if they're maintaining their body condition and they're not losing weight, because staying warm takes calories, feeding more fiber will actually increase the warmth, because the heat of fermentation of fiber is greater than the heat produced from digesting the other nutrients, the soluble carbs, protein, fat. So to create more core warmth, more fiber. But if your horse is losing weight because they're using too many calories for trying to stay warm, then you want to increase the fiber, but you also want to increase calories. And so calories, the fat is the densest source of calories. So I'd be looking for a feed that's maybe higher in fat and fiber, and so a higher calorie feed. Now, if your horse again is maintaining its body condition, and is comfortable in the winter, I'd still be sure to come in with a ration balancer to make sure that the easy keeper's getting protein, vitamins, and minerals.
Yeah. Great. And that's all the questions. So that was
Okay,
that was a
means
good presentation.
I have either just bored everybody and lost them,
I don't think so.
or I covered the subject.
I think you covered the subject.
I
That was
hope
great.
so.
No, it was great. Well, with that said, there's no other questions, so we'll say goodnight to everyone, and I thank everyone for coming. And our next webinar, I think we're going to have a fun one. We're trying to decide, and everybody can email me and say what they'd like, but we're going to do this on myths. Oh, I've got a new question. The next one's going to be on myths, Mythbusters. And we might have a panel. We might have more than just Dr. Katie from KER, but I'd like it to be a fun one, but I really like to put to bed some of these myths that we all hear quite often. So what's this new one? Okay, Sue said you covered the subject. Thanks so much, Katie.
Well, thank you. Thank you for letting me know.
That's wonderful. All right. Well, thank you very much. I know it was went a little longer than we thought, but wait a minute. Is that another one? No, I don't think so. I thought a new one came up, but I don't see it.
Okay.
Yeah, hopefully we'll see everybody next month, and I want it to be a fun one. Okay. Yep. Thank you, everyone. Good night.